The weathered hands holding the foreclosure notice trembled slightly as Marcus Chen read the words for the third time that morning. 72 hours. That's all the time he had left before losing everything he'd built since coming home from the Marines 15 years ago. How do you tell your honor roll daughter that everything she's worked for might disappear because her father failed? The paper crumpled slightly under his grip as he stood in the doorway of Chen's garage, watching Mrs. Patterson's sedan drip oil onto the concrete floor where he'd worked countless late nights trying to keep his small Oregon town business alive. "Everything all right, Marcus?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried concern as she noticed his distraction. Marcus forced a smile, the kind he'd perfected since Sarah died 5 years ago. The smile that said everything was fine when nothing was. "Just paperwork. Let's get your truck running." He folded the notice carefully, sliding it into his back pocket, where it felt like a lead weight against his hip. Through the garage's grimy windows, he could see his 17-year-old daughter Emma bent over her homework at the kitchen table in their small house across the street. Honor roll student. Dreams of studying environmental engineering at Oregon State. She had no idea that her acceptance letter might as well have been written in a language they couldn't afford to speak. Before we begin Marcus's story, I hope today brings you comfort, clarity, and something beautiful you weren't expecting. Comment below where you're watching from. Your every comment, like, and subscription helps us bring more heartfelt stories about real heroes to your life. Thank you. Because what you're about to hear will remind you that kindness never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to come home. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag that had seen too many years of grease and worry. The garage held 20 years of memories, photos of satisfied customers, his father's tools hanging in perfect order, the small American flag Sarah had given him when he first opened the business. "For the Marine who fixes everything," she'd said, kissing his cheek as he hung it above the workbench. But some things couldn't be fixed with wrenches and determination. As he bent over Mrs. Patterson's engine, a sound drifted in from the distance. Motorcycle engines, still far off but unmistakable. The rumble grew closer, then seemed to fade toward the highway. Marcus paused, listening. Something about that sound stirred a memory from 20 years ago. A memory that was about to change everything. 200 miles away, that same morning, Jake Morrison sat in a Nevada diner staring at a newspaper clipping his army buddy had forwarded 3 months ago. The headline read, "Small-town businesses struggle in economic downturn." And there, in a grainy black and white photo, was a face Jake had never forgotten. Marcus Chen, owner of Chen's Garage in Millbrook, Oregon. The same quiet eyes, the same steady presence that had saved Jake's life 20 years ago at Camp Pendleton. Jake's weathered fingers traced the edges of the clipping. He'd carried Marcus's kindness with him through 2 decades of sobriety, marriage, fatherhood, and a career helping other veterans find their way home. Every time he'd helped another struggling soldier, he thought of that rainy night in 1994 when a young Marine corporal had looked at him not as a problem to be solved, but as a brother worth saving. The memory was crystal clear. Jake Morrison, recently discharged from the Army, riding north from his father's funeral on a broken-down Harley when the transmission seized up outside Camp Pendleton's motor pool. That's when he'd met Corporal Marcus Chen. Jake had expected military bureaucracy, maybe a phone number for a tow truck if he was lucky. Instead, Marcus had taken one look at Jake's hollow eyes and Army discharge papers and simply nodded toward the warm garage. No questions about why Jake was traveling alone, no judgment about his appearance or the desperation that clung to him like smoke. Marcus had worked through the night, Not just fixing the transmission, but rebuilding it completely. They'd barely spoken, just the quiet communion of two veterans who understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. When Jake had offered his last $60 for the repair, Marcus had waved it off with 4 words that changed everything. Keep it for gas and food. Roads long ahead. Jake had stared at Marcus for a long moment that night, trying to understand why this stranger would show such kindness to someone who felt beyond saving. Then he'd ridden off into the dawn, carrying with him the first spark of hope he'd felt since coming home from Desert Storm. Now, staring at Marcus's photo in the diner, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Tommy? It's Jake Morrison. Remember that story I told you about the marine mechanic? The one who saved my life? I found him, and now he needs us." Within 48 hours, the network had spread like wildfire across the Southwest. Not through social media or formal organizations, but through the old-fashioned way, phone calls between men who understood debt and honor. Tommy Rodriguez in Arizona called Frank Williams in New Mexico. Frank called Patricia Santos in Colorado. Each conversation was brief, respectful, and ended the same way. "When do we ride?" Marcus didn't know it yet, but 200 miles away, his forgotten kindness was about to come home. These weren't outlaws or weekend warriors. They were construction workers, teachers, retirees, small business owners, people who'd been helped by strangers themselves and understood that some debts transcend money. They took vacation days, emptied savings accounts, and made arrangements with spouses and employers. 43 riders from 12 states united by a simple truth: when good people fall, good people catch them. Back in Millbrook, Marcus was fighting his own quiet battle. He'd pawned his Marine Service medals the month before, worked 16-hour days, and taken on any repair job that came through his door. Lawnmowers, farm equipment, anything with an engine. But the math was unforgiving. Medical bills from Sarah's cancer treatment, the business loan he'd taken to expand the garage, and 5 years of barely breaking even had created a hole too deep to climb out of alone. Emma knocked on the garage door frame, holding a manila envelope. "This came for you, Dad." Marcus recognized the return address immediately. Oregon State University. Emma's scholarship notification. He opened it with hands that suddenly felt too heavy, scanning the numbers. Partial academic scholarship, enough to cover tuition, but not room and board, books, or living expenses. Still thousands of dollars they didn't have. "What does it say?" Emma's voice carried the hope of 17 years old, the age when you still believe hard work and good grades can overcome any obstacle. "You got it, sweetheart. Full ride." The lie came easily, practiced from months of hiding their financial crisis. He'd figure out how to make it true later, even if it meant losing the garage. The lie he'd told Emma about her scholarship burned in his chest like acid. How many more lies would he have to tell before this was over? How many more nights would he stand here, pretending to be the strong father she needed while everything crumbled around them? That night, Marcus sat on his front porch with a cup of black coffee, staring at the stars above Millbrook's quiet streets. Sarah's photo sat on the small table beside him, her smile frozen in a moment when their biggest worry was whether Emma would sleep through the night. He touched the frame gently, whispering words he'd repeated every night since her funeral. "I'm trying, baby. I'm trying to keep it all together." The sound of distant engines interrupted his solitude. Motorcycles again, but closer this time. Marcus stood, listening as the rumble grew stronger, then seemed to circle the town's perimeter like wolves testing the boundaries of a camp. Something was happening, but he couldn't imagine what it might have to do with him. Marcus stood in his garage that night, surrounded by tools that had fed his family for 15 years, wondering if he'd failed the two people who mattered most. The weight of his secrets pressed down on him like the Oregon rain, relentless, cold, and impossible to escape. 300 miles south, Jake Morrison was leading a convoy through the Oregon night. They'd ridden hard from their meeting point in Redding, California, stopping only for gas and brief conversations about the man they were riding to help. Jake had told them Marcus's story, how a young Marine had seen past appearances to the person underneath, how one act of kindness had rippled through decades. What if he won't take it? Tommy Rodriguez had asked during their last stop. Jake had adjusted his helmet, thinking of Marcus's steady gaze that night at Camp Pendleton. Then we'll make him understand that this isn't charity. It's a debt, 20 years overdue. The convoy moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a mechanical prayer, 43 engines humming in harmony. They weren't riding for glory or recognition. They were riding because sometimes the only way to honor a gift is to pass it forward, and sometimes the only way to repay a debt is to find the person who made it possible in the first place. Marcus was under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's sedan when Emma burst through the garage door, her eyes wide with excitement and confusion. "Dad, there are motorcycles coming down Main Street. A lot of them." Marcus straightened, wiping his hands on his coveralls. Through the open garage door, he could see the first bikes turning the corner onto Main Street. Chrome gleaming in the morning sun, riders in leather jackets and faded jeans, moving with the careful precision of a formation that had been planned and practiced. The lead rider pulled up directly in front of the garage and cut his engine. He was older than Marcus remembered, grayer around the temples, but when he removed his helmet and their eyes met across 20 years, the recognition was instant and overwhelming. "Camp Pendleton, 1994, Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades. "You fixed my transmission." Marcus felt the world shift slightly, like standing on a boat as it adjusts to a changing tide. The memory flooded back. The young soldier with hollow eyes, the broken Harley, the long night in the motor pool. "You were heading to your father's funeral, Army veteran." Jake nodded, stepping closer. "You saved my life that night. Not just the bike. My life. I just did what anyone would do," Marcus said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. How many people would have opened their garage to a stranger at 2 a.m? How many would have worked through the night for free? "No," Jake said firmly. "You did what you would do, and that made all the difference." Behind Jake, the other riders had dismounted and stood in respectful silence. Marcus could see faces weathered by sun and wind, eyes that had seen hardship and chosen kindness anyway. These weren't strangers. They were family he'd never known he had. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is 20 years overdue." Marcus's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a cashier's check made out to him for exactly $127,000, the precise amount needed to pay off the garage mortgage, the house loan, and Emma's first year of college. He stared at the numbers, unable to process what he was seeing. "I can't accept this," he whispered. "It's not charity," Jake said. "It's a debt. You gave me back the will to live that night. I went on to become a social worker, helped hundreds of other veterans find their way home, got married, raised 2 kids, built a life, all because one Marine looked at me like I was worth saving." Tommy Rodriguez stepped forward, a man in his 50s with carpenter's hands and kind eyes. "Jake told us what you did, reminded us who we want to be. I was helped by a stranger once in Kansas. Never got to pay it back until now." One by one, other writers shared their stories. Frank Williams, a retired teacher who'd been given a second chance by a stranger's kindness. Patricia Santos, whose brother had been a Marine and would have done the same thing. Men and women who'd driven from 12 different states, taking vacation days and spending their own money for gas and hotels, united by a simple belief: some debts can only be repaid by paying them forward. Emma stood beside her father, beginning to understand the magnitude of what was happening. "Dad, who are these people?" Marcus looked at the faces surrounding him: construction workers, teachers, retirees, veterans, small business owners, and saw something he'd never expected to find: a family bound not by blood, but by shared values. "They're people who believe in honoring debts that can't be measured in money," he said softly. Jake's voice was steady, certain. "We collected this over 3 months. $20 here, $500 there, everyone giving what they could. It's not about the money, Marcus. It's about what you taught us. That kindness matters, that good people still exist, that sometimes helping a stranger is the most important thing you'll ever do." Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for months finally break free. The weight of fear and desperation that had pressed down on him like a physical force suddenly lifted, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten: hope. "I don't know how to repay this," he said. "You already did," Jake replied. 20 years ago. And every day since by being who you are." Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Neighbors emerged from houses and businesses, drawn by curiosity that quickly transformed into something deeper. Sheriff Williams arrived expecting trouble but found the most respectful gathering in the town's history. Local businesses donated food for an impromptu barbecue. The fire department provided tables, and the entire community came together around these strangers who'd ridden hundreds of miles to honor one of their own. As the sun set over the small Oregon town, Marcus found himself cooking alongside Jake and the other riders, sharing stories and laughter for the first time in months. Emma moved among the group with teenage curiosity, asking questions about their rides, their lives, their decision to come so far for her father. "Why did you really do this?" she asked Jake as they stood watching Marcus flip burgers on a borrowed grill. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying the man who'd changed his life. "Because 20 years ago, when I was ready to give up on everything, your father looked at me and saw someone worth saving. He didn't know my name, didn't know my story, didn't know if I'd ever amount to anything. He just saw someone who needed help, and he helped. No questions, no conditions, no expectations of return." Emma nodded slowly. "That sounds like Dad. The world doesn't make many like him anymore," Jake said. "Men who do the right thing when no one's looking. That's why we came. Not because he's loud or famous or important in any way the world usually measures. Because he's quiet and solid, and the kind of man you remember when life goes wrong and you think no one sees you anymore." The next morning, Marcus stood in the Millbrook Community Bank, holding the check that would save everything he'd worked for. The teller's eyes widened as she processed the deposit. "You're paying it all in full?" Marcus nodded. "On behalf of 43 people who never forgot how to say thank you." Outside, the morning breeze carried the sound of motorcycle engines starting up. The riders were leaving as quietly as they'd come, no fanfare or long goodbyes. Jake was the last to go, clasping Marcus's hand in both of his. "If you ever need anything," Jake said. "I won't," Marcus replied. but someone else will. And when they do, I'll remember what you taught me." "What did I teach you?" Marcus smiled. "That kindness multiplies, and that the road is long, but we don't have to travel it alone." 6 months later, Chen's garage had expanded into the empty building next door. Marcus had hired 2 part-time mechanics and started a program offering free repairs to veterans and struggling families. A small plaque above the workbench read, "Service above self," the same motto from his old Marine unit. Emma was thriving at Oregon State, calling home every Sunday with stories about her engineering classes and her volunteer work at the campus Veterans Center. During one of those calls, she mentioned something that made Marcus pause. "There's this guy in my chemistry class, Dad. His name's David, and he's a veteran having trouble with his motorcycle. I told him about you, about what you do for other vets. Think you could help him out?" Marcus smiled, remembering another young veteran who'd needed help long ago. "Tell him to bring it by the shop. We'll take a look." The circle was completing itself, as circles always do when they're drawn with love instead of obligation. One evening the following spring, as Marcus was closing up the garage, a young man appeared in the doorway. Early 20s, hollow eyes, pushing a broken-down motorcycle that had clearly seen better days. He looked exactly like Jake had 20 years earlier, lost, desperate, and trying hard not to show it. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said. "I heard you might be able to help with motorcycle repairs. I don't have much money, but—" Marcus held up a hand, studying the young veteran's face. He saw the same pain Jake had carried, the same uncertainty about whether he was worth saving. Without hesitation, Marcus gestured toward the warm garage. "Let's take a look," he said simply. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." As they wheeled the motorcycle into the shop, Marcus thought about Jake, about Emma, about the 43 riders who'd taught him that kindness is never wasted, only invested. He thought about Sarah, and how proud she'd be to see their daughter growing up with the same values they'd tried to instill. The young veteran watched nervously as Marcus examined the engine. "How much do you think it'll cost?" Marcus looked up from the motorcycle, seeing not a stranger, but a brother who needed help. "Let's get it running first. We'll figure out the rest later." 3 hours later, the motorcycle purred to life. The young veteran reached for his wallet, but Marcus waved him off with words that had traveled across decades and would travel across many more. "Keep it for gas and food," he said. "Roads long ahead." Some debts can't be measured in dollars. They're measured in lives changed, hope restored, and the quiet certainty that good people still exist in this world. Marcus Chen had learned that lesson 20 years too late, but just in time to pass it forward. And in the end, that's how legends are born. Not from the noise they make, but from the silence they leave behind, filled with the echoes of kindness that never stops traveling. The road is long, but we don't have to travel it alone. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to look past appearances and see the human being underneath. Sometimes all it takes is the courage to help when no one's watching, to give when you have little to spare, to believe that kindness matters even when the world suggests otherwise. If Marcus's story moved you, I want you to think about this. Somewhere in your life, there's someone who needs what you have to offer. Not money, necessarily. Maybe just a moment of your time, a listening ear, or the simple recognition that they matter. You have the power to be someone's Marcus Chen, to plant a seed of kindness that might not bloom for 20 years, but when it does, it could change everything. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of human decency. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And remember, in a world that often feels cold and disconnected, you might be the warmth someone desperately needs. The best investment you can make is in another human being, because kindness, once given, never really ends. It just keeps traveling down the road, looking for the next person who needs to remember that they're not alone.